Okay, let's begin. Today is our third and concluding lecture about modern religions and the afterlife in modern religions. Today we are going to talk about the Baha'i Faith. Baha'i Faith is an independent religious movement that was born in Iran in the middle of the 19th century. On the slide you see the main temple of the Baha'is in the United States or in America. It is located in Wilmette, Illinois, near the city of Chicago. All of Baha'i temples are constructed in a similar way. All of them have 9 doors, welcoming the people from all religions. 9 doors symbolize the 9 prophets that Baha'is recognize as the true prophets of God, starting with Abraham, then Moses, then Zoroaster, the founder of Zoroastrianism, then the Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, Krishna, the founder of one of the branches of Hinduism, Jesus, Muhammad, and the twin prophets of the Baha'i Faith, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Now, some general remarks. Baha'i Faith is a modern religious movement that belongs to the Abrahamic family of monotheistic religions. There are more than 5 million Baha'is in the world, from 5 to 6 millions. The largest Baha'i community resides in India. But overall, the Baha'i Faith is established in 233 countries and is represented in 2,112 racial, ethnic, and tribal groups. The headquarters of the Baha'i Faith is in Haifa, Israel, and that's what you see on your left slide. This is the city of Haifa, the Mount Carmel, and these are the famous Baha'i gardens. The shrine that you see here is the shrine that is dedicated to one of the prophets of the Baha'i Faith, the Bab. So here is some historical chronology and also the most important characters of the Baha'i Faith and the most important books. The Bab, whose name was Sayyid Ali Muhammad, the name Bab means gate in Arabic, is the first prophet of the Baha'i religion. He was born in 1819. He died in 1850. I will tell you more about his life and teachings later. The second prophet of the Baha'i Faith is Baha'u'llah himself, whose name was Mirza Hussein Ali from the city of Nur. And his religious title means glory of God in Arabic. He was born in 1817 and died in 1892. Baha'u'llah was bilingual. He was writing in Persian and Arabic. He wrote a lot of letters and books, but the most important book of Baha'u'llah is the so-called Most Holy Book that was completed by 1873. For Baha'is, the Most Holy Book has the same importance as the Gospels for Christians, the Torah for the Jews, or the Quran for the Muslims. After the passing of Baha'u'llah in 1892, the leadership of the new religious movement was given to his eldest son, Abbas Effendi. His religious title is Abdu'l-Baha, which means servant of glory. Baha'u'llah designated Abdu'l-Baha as his successor in his will and testament. And Abdu'l-Baha remained the leader of the Baha'i Faith until his own death in 1921. Now, Baha'i organization is based on democratic elections And on the top, you will find the Universal House of Justice, which is the supreme governing body of this religion. The first election of the Universal House of Justice took place in 1963. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the life and mission of the Bab. In 1844, the Bab declared his prophetic mission and sent his first 18 followers, whom he called the Letters of the Living, to various parts of the country to spread his message. We are talking about Iran, and we are talking about the mission that that looks very similar to the mission of Jesus. Like Jesus, the Bab had his apostles, the Letters of the Living. Unlike Jesus, though, who never wrote anything, the Bab revealed the scriptures of his new religion between 1847 and 1848. Those scriptures are called the Bayan, which means utterance, and those scriptures contain Persian and Arabic sections, and they cover various religious, moral, and legal topics, as well as the expectation for the future. The Bab predicted that very soon after his revelation, a new revelation will appear, and he predicted that the new prophet, or the new manifestation of God, as Baha'is call those people, will appear and lead the people toward the glorious future. Now, the Bab created his religious movement in the midst of Shia Islam. As you may know, Persia is the main country of Shia Islam. And in the Shia tradition of Islam, the future Messiah, or Mahdi, that will come at the end of days, will be not only a religious but also a political leader. Because of these political expectations, the new movement was resisted not only by the Shia religious community but also by political leaders in Iran. As a result, the movement was suppressed. The Babis defended themselves with arms. A series of military conflicts erupted in Iran, and in 1850 the Bab was imprisoned, sentenced to death, and executed. In this way, the Bab's mission did look like the mission of Jesus, who also had only 3 years to proclaim his message, and who also died as a result of this. The Bab had 6 years to proclaim his message, but the end of the Bab was as cruel as the end of Jesus. He was beaten, sentenced to death, and executed. In 1844, Baha'u'llah became the early follower of the Bab. Who was Baha'u'llah? Baha'u'llah was the contemporary of the Bab. He was born in 1817 to a wealthy and very influential Persian family. Baha'u'llah's father was the minister of state. He died when Baha'u'llah was very young, about 18 years old. And according to the custom, Baha'u'llah was offered the position of his father. However, he refused and spent his time by managing his father's estate. They were very wealthy, and raising his father's other children, also doing some charitable work. When he came to know about the Bab's revelation, Baha'u'llah became his follower, and he suffered the same fate that other followers suffered. In 1852, after one of the remaining Babis attempted to assassinate the Shah, the king of Persia, Thankfully, the assassination failed and the Shah survived, but the Shah decided to completely suppress the movement, and he imprisoned all of the remaining Babis. So in 1852, Baha'u'llah suffered imprisonment as a result of that, although he had nothing to do with the assassination attempt. He suffered imprisonment in an underground dungeon of Tehran. It was a very famous prison that was called the Black Pit. And it was there that he had his first revelations. He saw angels circling around him and telling him not to be afraid, and telling him that he will be victorious by the power of his pen. Since Baha'u'llah had nothing to do with the assassination attempt, and since he probably had some connections, he was released from the prison, but stripped of all of his possessions, and he was sent into a series of exiles. First, he and his family went to Baghdad, which is now the capital of Iraq, then to Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, then to Adrianople, which is now Edirne, and finally to the city of Acre in Ottoman Palestine, which is now in Israel. So he spent the rest of his life in this city, and that's why Israel is now the headquarters of the Baha'i Faith. In 1863, in the Garden of Rizwan, which means the Garden of Paradise in Baghdad, while preparing to move to Constantinople, Baha'u'llah for the first time made his declaration about his prophetic mission to his family. And Baha'is celebrate that as the birth of the new religion. Baha'u'llah died in 1892 and was buried in the shrine located next to the mansion of Bakhchi, where he spent the end of his life. On the slide, you see the shrine where the remains of Baha'u'llah are located. So on the left slide, you see a Baha'i temple in India that is built as the flower of lotus. Very beautiful, I think. And now let's talk about Baha'i teachings. Every religion has one key word around which the teaching of this particular religion revolves. So if we are talking about Christianity, this is universal love. If we are talking about Buddhism, this is selflessness. When it comes to Baha'i teachings, the key term here is the unity. When you read books about Baha'i faith, you will read a lot about unity, different kind of unities. But basically, Baha'is talk about three unities: the unity of God, the unity of religions, and the unity of humanity. Let me tell you briefly about each one. When it comes to the unity of God, Baha'is do not add anything substantial to other Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Islam, for example. Baha'is believe that God is one, unique, that God's essence is unknowable, that the only way to know the will of God is through his messengers, which Baha'is call manifestations of God. Now, when it comes to the second unity of religions, Baha'i faith here displays a unique feature. It believes in progressive revelation, and it also claims that the religions of the world, all of the religions of the world, or at least most of them, are actually true and come from the same source of the Holy Spirit. So they accept Abraham, Moses, Zoroaster, Buddha, Krishna, Jesus, Muhammad, and their own twin prophets, the Baba and Baha'u'llah, as the true prophets, As for the differences in religions that we discover through the examination of their teachings and practices, according to Baha'u'llah, they are mainly due to various social teachings and misinterpretations of scriptures that accumulate over the centuries. So let me say it again. This is a unique feature of Baha'i Faith. It accepts all religions as coming from the Holy Spirit, and therefore it says that a follower of each religion, if this person actually follows the spiritual part of the teaching of their religion, he will achieve spiritual progress. And finally, the third unity, which is the most important part of the Baha'i teaching, is the unity of humanity. According to Baha'is, the purpose of religion is to unite people. In fact, religious comes from the Latin word religio, which means to unite. So our first religions, the so-called primal religions, united people on the tribal level. Then we have religions that united various tribes into one nation. Then we have three international religions, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, that created an identity which goes beyond tribal, ethnic, and even national identities. Baha'u'llah is saying that the time has come for humanity to create a global identity, that all those different levels of unities that humanity had achieved, tribal, ethnic, national, should be crowned by global identity, which will lead to global peace and security. Now, it is quite a controversial statement, because if we look at the history of humanity, the only thing is for sure that humans just like to make war with each other. And it's very difficult to imagine that at some point humanity will be able to reconcile their differences. So what should people do in order to change the habits, the customs, the traditions, in order to achieve global peace and security? Here, Baha'is follow a series of principles that were formulated by Abdu'l-Baha, who was the eldest son of Baha'u'llah and who was the leader of the Baha'i movement after his father's passing until his own death in 1921. Abdu'l-Baha is considered to be the center of the Baha'i covenant. He traveled to Europe and to the United States, to Canada, to Egypt. He did a series of missionary journeys in which he preached and delivered the message of his father. And in those talks, he formulated the following principles that humanity should follow in order to speed up the process of globalization. The first principle is the independent investigation of truth. This is very important because if we continue to imitate our ancestors, our parents, if we continue to follow our tradition, then we will not be able to change our ways. So independent investigation of truth instead of blind imitation. That is the first important principle of Baha'i Faith. Then the second one is about the abandonment of all forms of prejudice. And here we're talking about religious, political, social, economic, intellectual, etc. prejudices. Let me say something about religious prejudices. As Baha'u'llah says, each religion preaches the same when it comes to spirituality. Spirituality is selflessness. And therefore, each religion is trying to teach humans how to be spiritual or selfless. However, the centuries roll by, and people misinterpret religious teachings. And now, if we compare Islam with Christianity or Islam with Buddhism, we may think that those three religions are completely different from each other. So people live by their beliefs. And if their beliefs are in stark contradiction with the beliefs of other people, that will eventually lead to conflict and, in the worst situation, to war. So therefore, Baha'u'llah says religious wars will be something that no one will be able to stop unless the adherents to various religions will start reconciling their teachings with each other. Now, let me move on to another principle, and here we will be talking about social, economic justice, etc. So the next principle is about universal education and language. Baha'u'llah proposes the introduction of one language. It may be a language that is already established, or it may be a new language that is created for that purpose. And Baha'u'llah says that this language should be either chosen or invented and should be introduced into any school all over the world so that the communication among people will be more accessible. The same with universal education. Baha'u'llah proposes that not only school education, but also university education should become obligatory or mandatory. Of course, the affordability of this education is another and separate issue. The next principle is about racial and gender equality. It is impossible to create a global peaceful society until races and genders will have real equality, not only equality on paper, but real equality. So the racial and gender equality, these two topics, these two themes of Baha'i teachings were always at the center of the American Baha'is and their efforts to eliminate racial prejudices and to make men and women be equal. The next principle is about economic justice. Baha'u'llah says that it is impossible to create a just global society in the situation when some countries are extremely rich and others are extremely poor. So he does not propose what people today would call socialism, redistribution of wealth, but he proposes the elimination of extreme poverty and wealth. The instruments of this elimination may be different, but the elimination of extreme poverty and wealth is very important because it will create in the long run the so-called global middle class. And without the global middle class, no peaceful global society could exist. The next principle is about harmony between religion and science. Here Baha'u'llah says that true science and true religion can never be in conflict with each other because these are simply two different ways for humanity to try to make sense of the world around them. Religion, of course, can produce some misinterpretations and prejudices. And as Abdu'l-Baha says, if you find some religious teaching that does not pass the test of science and reason, then this religious teaching simply is a prejudice and you should not believe it. The same applies to science. When science is trying to go beyond its own limitations, its own borders, to make claims that are in fact the realms of theology, the realms of the world that is beyond the world of sensory perception. And finally, the last principle is about politics. Baha'u'llah himself prefers constitutional monarchy as the most efficient way to organize society. In fact, he wrote a series of letters while he was alive, to various kings and presidents, to various leaders, secular and religious leaders of the world. And he wrote a letter to the Queen of England where he praised her for establishing the parliament and the constitutional monarchy. So he believes that the constitutional monarchy is the best way, but he also approves of a republican government. What he really opposes is tyranny of all kinds. Until tyranny is abolished, no global peaceful society is possible. And he proposes, more specifically, the establishment of the so-called Supreme Tribunal, or as I would say, a world judicial branch. This proposal is quite concrete. Baha'u'llah says that each country should delegate, should elect 2 representatives that will become part of the Supreme Tribunal. So if we have, let's say, 200 something countries, we will have as a result about 500 people in the Supreme Tribunal. 1 person, 1 vote. This Supreme Tribunal should have the responsibility to discuss the issues of war and peace and territorial disputes. And the ideal way to make a decision is to come to a consensus. However, if consensus cannot be achieved, then there should be a secret voting. As I said, 1 person, 1 vote, and the majority wins. And as a result, all the sides that were involved in the discussion should accept the decision of the Supreme Tribunal. Now, this may sound like the United Nations, but it is not really the United Nations, because the United Nations, number one, is not an elected body. The Security Council is not an elected body. Number two, not all the nations are represented equally. And number three, the decisions of the Security Council are not obligatory to all the nations, and some of the nations, like the United States, for example, have the power of veto. Now, Baha'is distinguish between the so-called lesser peace and the most great peace. Lesser peace is what Baha'i describe as the global society that is bound together by political arrangements and economic systems and social culture. In other words, the lesser peace may come, and as Baha'is believe, will come as a result of political unification, external unity. Like, for example, the United States. The United States has a system of laws and institutions, and all Americans share their obedience to those institutions. However, when it comes to culture, American culture is very diverse. You can find people from different parts of the world, people who profess different religions, people who have different beliefs, etc., etc., etc. So the unification is external. Now, the lesser peace is compared by Baha'is to the so-called most great peace. The difference between lesser and most great peace is like the difference between the marriage of convenience and the marriage of love. So the marriage of convenience is simply an external union of 2 people, but without inner feelings toward each other. The marriage of love is, first of all, the internal union. And this internal union is usually resulting in an external union of marriage. So most great peace, in other words, is a global society in which people are spiritualized and are united on a spiritual level. That does not necessarily mean that all the people should become Baha'is, since Baha'is recognize most other religions as being legitimate and true in their own ways. So spirituality here is more important than religious affiliation. But when it comes to specifically Baha'i teachings, Baha'u'llah in his most holy book delivers certain messages that distinguish Baha'i religious teachings from the teachings of other religions. The most holy book that was finished by Baha'u'llah around 1873 is written in such a way as to attract the followers of other religions by abolishing some of the laws in reference to those religions. For example, I will mention some of the most important laws that have been abolished in Baha'i Faith. First, monasticism and asceticism. Monasticism and asceticism are part of Buddhism and Catholicism and Orthodoxy, for example. In the Baha'i Faith, monasticism and asceticism are forbidden, and Baha'u'llah is saying that every human being should be in society with people. Then the Holy War. Baha'i Faith is the only religion that explicitly forbids the Holy War. And of course, this is kind of goes without saying, because you cannot really create a global unity if you stand for the Holy War. There are three religions that explicitly allow the Holy War: Hinduism, some forms of Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism, biblical Judaism. Now, the destruction of books and ban on association with other people. In Baha'i Faith, the destruction of books is forbidden. And by destruction, of course, we mean not only a real physical destruction of the books, but also censorship. And ban on association with other people that are not of your religion, or that maybe do not have any religion at all. In Baha'i Faith, people are allowed to have spouses that belong to other religions, and also spouses that are atheists. Next, confession of sins and other practices that lead to people's humiliation before other people are also abolished in the Baha'i Faith. And this is, of course, in reference to the Christian ritual of confession or penance. A special class of priests is abolished. But even more important is that slavery is explicitly forbidden. And again, Baha'i Faith is the only religion that explicitly forbids slavery. Both Christianity and Islam do not forbid slavery. The Apostle Paul allows slavery to exist. However, he says that it is better to free the slave. But if you cannot do that, then you should treat the slave as a human being with dignity. Now, in the Baha'i teachings, slavery and begging are forbidden. And finally, education, arts, and sciences that lead to the progress of humanity are promoted. Now, let me tell you briefly about the Baha'i organization. Baha'is call it the administrative order. On the slide, you see the building of the Universal House of Justice, the supreme governing body of the Baha'i Faith. Baha'i administration splits into two parts, the elected and the appointed. We are more interested in the elected part. And here we are talking about the local, national, and international level. Now, on a local level, Baha'is elect their representatives every year by secret ballot without nominations and campaigning. So no nominations, no campaigning. These two rules make sure that there is no partisan politics, there is no money involved in election. A person simply comes, takes a piece of paper and writes down 9 names of the local community, of the people who he or she believes would be best serving as the leaders of the community for a year. So 9 Baha'is in good standing who are best suited to serve the community for a year and are at least 21 years old could be elected. Then each local community will send their representatives to the national convention, and every year on the national level the same elections will take place, and as a result 9 Baha'is will be elected to serve as the leaders of the national community. And every 5 years, all the members of the national spiritual assemblies, that's how they are called, local spiritual assemblies and national spiritual assemblies, all those members will come to Haifa, to Israel, and elect the 9 members of the Universal House of Justice. So we are talking about 2,000 people coming once in 5 years to Haifa and electing 9 members of the Universal House of Justice, and the first election took place only in 1963. Now let's talk about afterlife and Baha'i beliefs and teachings about heaven and hell. By the way, on the left you see the Baha'i symbol, 9-pointed star. Some of my students called it the superstar of David. I think this is a great name. So Baha'u'llah teaches that apocalyptic terms that we discover in various books in the Bible, for example, in the book of Revelation, such as heaven and earth, the sun, the moon, the stars, resurrection of the dead, return of the prophets, etc., that all those terms should be interpreted symbolically, not literally. Because when you encounter a passage like that, when you read in the Bible that in the end of days the sun will be darkened and the moon will stop giving light and the stars will fall from the sky and the people will get resurrected, will come from the graves, etc., that should not have a literal meaning, because it does not correspond to what we observe in reality. So all those various expressions are simply symbolic expressions, and they refer to spiritual states. So heaven and hell, for example, are symbolic terms that signify spiritual states of being close to God. And what does this mean, to be close to God? It means to be a good moral person. The more moral you are, the more virtuous you are, the more you are close to God, because God is the sum of all virtues. Also, Baha'i teachings tell us that every individual has an immortal soul and continues his or her existence after the death of the physical body. However, as Baha'u'llah says, we do not really know, and we cannot know what kind of spiritual existence that will be, because the spiritual world is radically different from our material existence. And therefore, the only thing that we can do is to use certain terms that are associated with our material existence in order to refer those words to the spiritual existence we do not really understand. Here are some other teachings about the afterlife that belong to Abdu'l-Baha, the leader of the movement after Baha'u'llah. After the death of the body, the human soul remains in the degree of purity to which it has evolved during its earthly life. In other words, when you die, you do not find yourself changed in terms of your inner world. Your inner world remains with you, and you start progressing spiritually after that. Second, unlike material objects that can be transformed into one another, human soul has an innate individuality and could never evolve into something other than itself. So, in other words, your self-identity is unique, and your self-identity will continue in the spiritual world, and you will not be able to change yourself into anyone else. And finally, in the afterlife, human souls will acquire spiritual means of perception and will be able to recognize and communicate with their friends and loved ones. Now, after those general remarks about the afterlife in Baha'i teachings, I would like to finish this lecture and this course back where we started. And we did start with Buddhism and the discussion of the concept of reincarnation. And then we moved on to Greek and Hellenistic philosophy, to Plato and Cicero, and we discussed their arguments for the immortality of the soul. In Baha'i Faith, the teachings about afterlife are not only spiritual and scriptural, but also rational and take the form of the arguments. Those arguments come mainly from Abdu'l-Baha. You see his portrait on the left slide, when he was already an old man traveling to different parts of Europe and America in order to promulgate the teaching of his father. In many of his talks, Abdu'l-Baha delivers various rational arguments against reincarnation and for the immortality of the soul. What I will do is I will simply read those arguments one by one because I arranged those arguments in a logical form and gave each argument its own title. Some of those arguments may remind you of what we discussed in Plato and Cicero, but many of the arguments Abdu'l-Baha is offering are unique and really creative. Plus, we have to remember that the Baha'i Faith, like all other monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, rejects the idea of reincarnation. So, therefore, Abdu'l-Baha gives us a series of arguments against the notion of reincarnation, and also provides a series of arguments for the immortality of the soul. So let me start with the first argument, and we are talking about arguments against reincarnation, argument from parallel worlds. The outward is the expression of the inward. The earthly realm is the mirror of the heavenly kingdom, and the material world is in accordance with the spiritual world. In the sensible world, the divine appearances are not repeated, for no created thing can be identical with another in every way. Hence, Abdu'l-Baha concludes, reincarnation, which is the repeated manifestation in this world of the same spirit with its former essence and conditions, is thus impossible. The second argument against reincarnation, the argument from imperfection. Number one, change of nature is impossible through renewal and return, since matter always remains in the state of imperfection. Number two, it is thus clear that recurrence and return to the material world are not the means of attaining perfection, as reincarnationists claim. Next argument from incorporeality of the spirit. Number 1, believers in reincarnation conceive of the body as a vessel and the spirit as its contents, like water and cup, with the water being emptied from one cup and poured into another. However, the spirit is an entirely incorporeal being. It does not enter or exit, but is connected with the body as the sun is with the mirror. Hence, reincarnation is impossible. Argument from divine power. The major argument of the reincarnationists was that according to the justice of God, each must receive his due either in the present or future life. But this would make spiritual progress depend on humans themselves, and not on God's supreme and special influence. If creation went forward according to only one rule, how could the all-encompassing power make itself felt? Hence, reincarnationists are wrong. Next one, from natural law. Number 1, advancing and moving through the worlds in a direct line and according to the natural law is the cause of existence. And the movement against the natural order and arrangement of things is the cause of extinction. The return of the spirit after death is incompatible with the natural movement and contrary to the divine order, and therefore reincarnation is impossible. Here is another one from unhappiness. According to the views of reincarnationists, we come back to earthly life in order to reap out our rewards and punishments. However, on this dusty earth, all humankind are suffering. Here no man is at rest as a reward for what he has performed in former lives, nor is there anyone so blissful as seemingly to pluck the fruit of bygone anguish. Therefore, reincarnationists must be wrong. And the last 3 arguments against reincarnation. The argument from unlimited creation. Number 1. Some reincarnationists believe that God's creation is limited to our material universe. If this were so, what would be the harvest of creation? Were such a notion true, then all created things, all contingent realities, and this whole world of being, all would be meaningless. But since creation is unlimited, human afterlife consists not in earthly reincarnations, but in spiritual progress and immortality. Here is another one from scriptural interpretation. Number 1. The notion of a return is indeed referred to in the Holy Scriptures. Believers in reincarnation interpreted those allusions in terms of their own theories. In reality, those passages meant the return of the qualities, conditions, effects, perfections, and inner realities of the light which recur in every dispensation. The reference is not to specific individual souls and identities. And finally, the argument from undesirability. The material world is imperfect. Who then would like to be incarnated again in such an imperfect world? And now, a series of arguments for the immortality of the soul or spirit. The first argument from spirit not being part of the physical body. The first premise is that material existence is subject to composition and decomposition, which is certainly true. The second premise is that human spirit is not a material entity because its power persists while the person is asleep and the body is resting, because changes in the body, including amputations of bodily organs, do not affect the spirit, because it is not available to our senses, because the body itself does not produce thought, which is the characteristic feature of human mind or spirit, and because man is not a captive of nature and can discover its secrets. So therefore, Abdu'l-Baha concludes, Human spirit is not subject to decomposition and is immortal. Here is another argument that I personally find to be very strong. Argument from nature. Number one, human intelligence is nowhere to be found in the natural world, except in us, humans. What is present in parts should also exist in the whole, but it doesn't. Hence, human intelligence or spirit is not part of nature. But anything in nature is subject to composition and decomposition, and human spirit is not a natural or material entity. Therefore, human spirit is not subject to decomposition, which means that it is immortal. Here is another argument from unchanging spirit. The spirit within oneself never changes, and therefore is single and not composed of elements. Non-composed entities are not subject to decomposition, therefore the human spirit is indestructible and hence immortal. Arguments from forms. Number one, material entities cannot possess two forms simultaneously. However, the spirit of man could conceive all geometrical forms simultaneously. Therefore, spiritual reality is different from the limitations of matter and hence immortal. Arguments from effects. Number one, non-existing entities do not leave traces or effects of their activity. But human life produces a lasting impact on the world of nature and society, and therefore, human spirit should be more than just a combination of material elements. Arguments from sacrifice that may remind you of Cicero and his proofs. People would not sacrifice their lives if their spirits were not immortal. Prophets of God suffered to death for the benefit of humanity. Therefore, human spirit is immortal. Argument from conservation of energy. Number one, there is no total annihilation in the world of creation. The first law of thermodynamics. Number two, but man is part of creation. Therefore, human beings are immortal. Argument from gradation of things. Gradation of things presupposes the existence of the superlative degree. The world of matter is the world of mortality. Therefore, immortality as the superlative degree of mortality must exist as well. And finally, the argument from the inner sight. Inner sight is greater than sensory perception. By inner sight, Abdu'l-Baha means intuition. Inner sight is greater than sensory perception, which uses the instrumentality of the body. Should the mind be the extension of the body, its power should also be in the same proportion, but it is not. Therefore, human mind or spirit is different from the body, and therefore is immortal. So on this positive note, I would like to conclude this lecture, and also I would like to conclude this course about the afterlife. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you someday either in this world or in the world to come.